unless you've had your head stuck in the sand, you certainly know that for a long time now here in Hartford, the Macheteros trial, you could call it, has been going on, concerned with the West Hartford Wells Fargo Depot robbery. With us are a couple folks who know a lot about it. Ron Fernandez wrote a book, Los Macheteros. He has been following it for a number of years now, 5 years, 5 years correctly. Yes. And Jim Bergen is a local lawyer who defended one of the defendants in the trial. Folks, thanks very much for coming.
Good morning.
Let me just begin with sort of a general question here. First, Ron, what does this mean? What does it mean in the whole scope of this trial and this event here and happened in West Hartford now?
Well, I think the larger issue for us as a society, as Americans, is just really what happens to Puerto Rico and our relations with them. Maybe one way of saying it quickly is that the Los Macheteros, at least in my opinion, are the tip of an iceberg. And my big fear is that that iceberg is going to melt unless we as a society address the political and economic issues which move these people into political activity in the first place.
I think there's some sense that, that this is a rather small group of people pushing for independence, and that there really isn't that overwhelming desire in Puerto Rico for that. Is that inaccurate?
If I had to make a guess, and it's no more than a guess, I'd say the population is split on an everyday basis, a third for independence, a third for Commonwealth, a third for statehood. But I don't believe that's a question that you can address in a vacuum. In other words, you have to know what's going to happen to the military. You have to know what's going to happen to Social Security. You have to know what's going to happen to citizenship before a Puerto Rican can make really an intelligent assessment of their future.
Yeah. All right, Jim, you defended the person who got off, who was acquitted here. Again, the defendant, your client was?
Carlos Ayas Suarez.
Now, why was he able to not be convicted here? How do you assess all this?
Well, Jeff, my view is that the jury in his case was able to focus very specifically on the evidence that related to him. And in fact, he was innocent. I think justice was done. But he was involved really just with the Three Kings event. He was originally charged with the robbery and the conspiracy to commit the robbery, but the judge threw out those charges at the end of the government's case. And for the rest of his role, the jury was able to focus on evidence that the government had itself, and were able to decide that the Three Kings event was not the interstate transportation of stolen money. It was, in fact, a political, cultural event, an effort to try to bridge between the people in Puerto Rico and the people here in Connecticut.
What was his role, though, with that specific Three Kings?
His role was more or less at the last minute. He was asked to come up because he can speak Spanish and because he's done a lot of political and cultural activities down in Puerto Rico. And he was asked to come up and help organize, get through the survey the day before the gift giveaway, keep the lines in order, take pictures. Pictures were later used to claim credit that the Macheteros, in fact, did do the gift giveaway, and so that was essentially his role.
Yeah, and as Juan Segarra Palmer has said on television since the trial ended, that indeed that money, the money that was used to pay for the gifts, was money that came from the heist in West Hartford.
Well, if he said that after the trial, that's at odds with the evidence. The evidence that came out at trial was that there were a number of doctors who have contributed to the organization called Los Socos. And as far as my client understood, actually my client didn't know the source of the money at all. But as far as the jury understood, it could have been, it certainly was possible, because the Macheteros did have that money. Yeah. But they also had money for over 10 years from dues, from contributions. It's a full-fledged political organization. It's not just a group of people who worked solely with Wells Fargo funds.
I wanted to sort of ask you then about it. Certainly you've been involved in this trial so heavily. How do you then see where we're at this point? Now this part of this case is over.
Well, legally, for my client, it's all over. Right. He's back to Puerto Rico, and he's going to continue with his archaeological work and with his political work. I think with the next trial coming up, the government's going to have to reassess what they're going to do with the 9 remaining defendants, because they've seen that the jury is able to discriminate between the different defendants and what they did. I agree with Ron, however, that in the bigger picture, this is just a real tip of the iceberg as to what the real political issues are. For me, I was a novice, just like most of your viewers, I'm sure. I didn't know the first thing about the political issues in Puerto Rico. But I do think we're going to have to continue to assess what we're doing with that relationship. It's really an anachronism to have a people that are really a possession. They're not a country. They're not a state. It just doesn't make any sense, and there's very few of these situations left in the world.
Ron, does the result of this trial give credence to any part of the movement? You said one-third, one-third, one-third in Puerto Rico.
I guess, yes. I think, at least in my own opinion, it will tremendously energize the movement, because it seems to me we've underestimated significantly the number of Puerto Ricans who regard Los Macheteros as heroes. Heroes are a little strong, but certainly as patriots. And to the extent that they're perceived as patriots, the guilty verdicts, at least from what I've been able to read of the Puerto Rican newspapers, are being perceived as unjust or unfair. It does pay to remember that all three parties on the island, statehood, Commonwealth, and the Independence Party, all regard Puerto Rico, Jim said this, we didn't use this word, as a colony. There's agreement from all three parties that that's a colony.
Was there much concern in the Puerto Rican community in Connecticut, in Hartford, to what was going on here? Was there attention here, either one of you?
Yeah, there was a lot of attention paid by the local community. It was very encouraging.
How was
a lot
it
of support.
focused, I'm wondering, though? Because occasionally you saw demonstrations, but where was the focus? Where was the...
Well, a lot of it was just behind-the-scenes support for the people who are going through this ordeal. This is not an easy ordeal to be brought from your country thousands of miles away. You don't have your family, you don't have your job, you don't have the people with whom you normally relate, and the people provided that kind of support. Also, some of the local political leaders came out to support the group when it came time for some of the bail issues, for example, and to try to sensitize the community. I don't think it was as successful as you would hope, because you would always hope for a whole lot more, but I think that the people in Connecticut, not only the Puerto Rican community, but generally, are much more sophisticated now with respect to the issue than they were before. They didn't even know anything about it before.
How about the role of the federal government, the U.S. government in this thing, in making the arrests and the investigation, in the holding of a couple of the defendants for long periods of time, and then the trial itself?
Well, from my point of view, particularly the treatment of Mr. Ojeda Rios is scandalous. He's still, as we're sitting here in Metropolitan Correctional Center, and depending upon how you count the time, has spent, under the Bail Reform Act, more time in pretrial detention than anyone else in United States history. You had an individual with a heart condition who was chained to a bed in a hospital. So in terms of those kinds of things, that seems to me nothing but in a human rights sense, but scandalous.
Well, why did that happen, Jim? I mean, did it happen because these are Puerto Ricans, and there was less of a concern over their sort of civil rights than if it were you or me? I mean, I don't understand. Well, how do you see it?
I certainly, I'm not going to come up with an explanation for it. I think it's not fair. It's not right. It was not like this senior citizen, so to speak, was going to get up and jump and run away. I think it was a little heavy-handed. I really don't know what I'd attribute it to, although I do know that a lot of what took place throughout the trial was political. While the government on the one hand said this is not a political case, this is the same government that hired people to stand on the rooftops with machine guns when later people went out on bond, and of all the people that went out on bond, which ultimately included all the defendants, there was never one infraction. And that's a very unusual record for people who are that threatening that you need to have machine guns to keep the community safe. And with the sirens whirring every time they went up and down the streets, it was really unnecessary.
So what, but unnecessary, I mean, that's political? Why is that political?
Well, it's political because
it make the case outside of the courtroom?
Well, clearly, it does two things. It inflames the potential jury pool, and it tells everybody in Connecticut who is watching this case, don't listen to these people, these Harvard-educated, these lawyers, these teachers, these people who fit on the streets of West Hartford and Glastonbury. Don't pay attention to the message these people are bringing you, because these are dangerous criminals, when the fact is all of these people are politically motivated people. Now, it may be that some of the things that they did are crimes, but the fact is that they're politically motivated people. All of their actions are defined in those terms, and the government did all it could to try to defuse that. To some extent, they were successful, but not completely. I think the people out there understand when they heard the testimony about what the FBI had done in this case, and when they recognized the people, the defendants themselves, when the truth came out, they recognized that these were not the terrorist criminals that the government was making them out to be. They did, in fact, in some respects, as the jury has found, committed acts which under our laws are criminal. But they're political people, they're educated people, they're people who are motivated no less than the people who started our country.
Ron?
No, the only point is it essentially echoes what Jim just said. When They used to bring the jurors up. The jurors would have to drive their cars to a spot and be picked up by a van. They would come in then. They used to, occasionally, they would tell the jurors to meet them in a different spot, and they would come up through different routes. They would change the routes. And that's clearly not something you're doing other than to supposedly stop this political group, I guess, from blowing people up or whatever. That's a message, it seems to me, the jury, they had to draw that conclusion that these were very dangerous people. It seems to me that grossly prejudiced the case. It's remarkable that Jim and Carlos managed to achieve what they did.
So then, credit to the jury system,
yes,
actually, that the jurors were able to overcome that, at least in Carlos's case. It was not an easy thing because they had to recognize in themselves. In fact, I addressed that in the summation. You have to recognize these feelings you have when you are whisked in and out. You're kept anonymous. Anywhere you go, you have 3 or 4 guards. But they were able to overcome it, at least in Carlos's case. But it definitely had an effect.
Yeah, but of course they only did it. You're right, in only Carlos's case. So is it unfair to say then the other 4 actually received an unfair trial here? That in fact the jury was affected by what was happening with at least the transportation of these folks, and that's what affected what happened.
The thing that seemed to me the most unfair of all is that they were not judged by a jury of their peers. I don't believe it's possible to really understand the motivation, exactly what Jim was talking about, unless you have some perception of Puerto Rican history. A very quick example, Aguila Blanca, the code name that Victor used. That is actually the name of a Puerto Rican patriot who operated from 1898 to 1904 against American colonial authority. Victor, of course, chose that deliberately. Any educated Puerto Rican would instantaneously identify with that. An American audience, of course, had no idea what was being said. Of course, it had to be translated. White eagle. Whoa, that's White eagle. I've never seen a white eagle.
On a more pedestrian level, too. The people didn't understand the evidence. It's all in Spanish. Thousands of documents. Hundreds of tapes, thousands of conversations, and the people do not understand the language. And the terror that the defendants must have felt going through this trial when the jury never could get a sense of intonation. In fact, the way the tapes were done before the jury, they didn't have the translations in front of them as they were listening to the tapes. So they would hear the tapes, it was all gobbledygook, and then they would read a translation that was given to them by a paid government translator. So it really was not a model for fairness. I would certainly wouldn't want to be tried that way.
So to get a jury of the defendant's peers would be to have the trial in San Juan?
As we had very vigorously moved throughout for it, we thought we were very well supported in the law for that kind of a move. It would have been much more convenient for everybody. But I think, frankly, the government recognized there would have been some greater risks of more acquittals had the jury really been able to focus with a feeling sense, with a comprehensive sense as they evaluated the tapes and the record.
But it just goes to a point that Jim was making about the translation. If you say in Spanish, embarazado, embarrassed, if you say that in Puerto Rico, it doesn't mean embarrassed, it means pregnant. It might say embarrassed on a piece of paper. Unless you understand the culture, the intonation, the facial expression, there's no real way, it seems to me, that you can get an accurate reading of what was said in those tapes. Yet that is the conditions under which the jury had to operate. Again, a Puerto Rican would not have need to, there would be no necessity to explain that.
Yeah. How about Victor Herrera? I mean, through all of this, there's no question that he has...
He called us last evening.
How's he doing? Oh, those green eyes. He has really sort of now obtained sort of a folk hero, I think, sort of characterization around him now.
I'm going to let Jim know that one.
Say something about that, because clearly the public is focused on Herrera himself.
They are, but I think the original focus was the folk hero of every working man's dream to get rich quick. I think that's been debunked, and I think people now understand him as someone who was so motivated by the political situation and the status of Puerto Rico that he would be willing to basically uproot his entire life. His past, present, and future are entirely thrown together in one bold act, and then give all of these resources to a group of people whom he really did not know intimately, but who he knew shared his political ideology. If that isn't a statement of a person's depth of feeling and conviction, I don't know what is. And if there is a hero connotation to that, I think is probably similar to some of the acts that were taken by the founding fathers of this country.
Yeah, and there's an argument that Segura Palma has made since the end of this trial, that indeed he's comparing him to revolutionaries here.
there's an issue. For example, Menachem Begin in 1945 robbed, along with other people, the Agro Bank, in that case against British colonialism. I think many people in this country would perceive that as against the law, but nonetheless will invite a higher law to judge it. We'll look the other way because we understand his cause. I think a similar thing is operating here. I think that's part of what Mr. Segarra is trying to ask us to look at. There were certainly a number of examples in the Revolution where American citizens broke the law, and nonetheless, people look the other way.
Yeah, but go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, you know, as a Connecticut lawyer and someone who understands the importance of law, that clearly is a violation of the law. And if Victor Herrera is nabbed, so to speak, I think he should stand to justice here in Connecticut. But in the larger picture, I think he can take on some sort of a heroic role if people take that political point of view. In other words, it may have been a criminal act. It has other dimensions to it, exactly. And I think the people understand that.
Okay, very good. We're going to run. Appreciate you coming, Ron Fernandez, Jim Bergen.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here. All right. Well, stay with us. We'll have more New England Sunday in just a minute. Well, thanks for joining us this New England Sunday, and next week, a look at the unseen homeless in Hartford by two men that went looking for them. And next on Channel 3, it's CBS Sunday Morning with Charles Carrault. Today, the top story is a report on America's National Guard and how to use it in the war on drugs. Also, a tribute to Charlie Chaplin. That's next on CBS Sunday Morning. And until next week, we hope you have a very nice week, and I'll see you next week. I'm Jeff Cole.
80% of all marriages are intruded upon by affairs. The outcome for many? Divorce. Why must so many search outside of their marriage for love, sex, or just someone to talk to? Life after cheating. Surviving infidelity on the next Geraldo at 10 here on FSB 3.